Okay, so we've talked about Toulmin argument. We've applied it to kind of general claims, but how do we apply it to rhetorical analysis? So I'm sure you have all heard about Bernie Sanders and maybe have already listened to a few speeches he has made. So imagine I've assigned you the task of doing a rhetorical analysis on a Bernie Sanders speech. Okay, and you've said your thesis is, yeah, Bernie Sanders really builds his credible ethos and ultimately persuades us that he is a good next president, right? So we've made that general claim. We're saying that the overall speech is persuasive. But imagine now you're writing a body paragraph and you're like, how am I gonna dive into this argument? Well, you could use Toulmin. Right? And just as we did in the first part of this lecture, we could start with a claim, right? So let's say we're looking at that speech and we're like, what was persuasive in this? And we're like, you know what? It was Bernie's personal stories. So I might make that claim. Bernie Sanders uses personal stories in his speech to connect to viewers in this case. So Sanders uses stories, maybe personal stories, to connect to readers / viewers or Americans, right? Voters, whatever group you would want to name there. So notice we've made a debatable, reasonable statement. I could say, you know, he didn't. I wasn't connected at all to that, right? So now we need some evidence to support this or some sort of data, right? So what could we use? Well, maybe a quote, maybe an example of Bernie Sanders in his speech using a personal story, right? So I could say, in the beginning of his speech, Sanders shares the story of his first arrest. And then I might include that quotation, right? And notice now we've brought in some proof that, yeah, he does indeed use personal stories to connect with readers. We've stated where, and we've brought in a quotation or maybe a snippet of the speech where he shares that personal story. Now, if we think about our qualifier, right, notice we've already said when he does this. It answers that question in the beginning, right? So I'll put it over here too. In the beginning of his article. He doesn't do this everywhere, but in the beginning of his article or in the beginning of his speech. And that's qualifiers. But now that is the hard part, right? Now we need to think about the warrant. Meaning, what's the underlying assumption here? We've said, we made the claim Sanders uses stories to connect to readers. We've brought in proof, right? We've quoted this moment where he shares the story of an arrest when he was arrested for participating in a protest, right? Well, what are we saying? What's the underlying principle here? When Sanders shares personal stories, it helps us better understand his viewpoint. Or more generally, sharing personal stories helps connect readers or viewers to the author. So personal stories helps viewers connect to the writer, in this case, the speaker. That's what we're saying, right? That's the underlying principle that we're working with. But now we have to think about backing, right? How could we back this up that it does actually connect? Well, I like to use, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. You could bring in, again, another story, an anecdote. We could bring in statistics. We could bring in an expert opinion, right? We could say, according to everything's an argument. When people use personal stories, it does heighten the pathos of the argument, right? But one strategy I like to use is if this hadn't been done. And I think that sometimes helps back up our underlying warrants. So if this hadn't been done, if Bernie Sanders hadn't brought in this personal stories, then what? Maybe we wouldn't have understood, or maybe viewers wouldn't understand why Bernie Sanders believes so strongly in human rights or in our freedom to protest. Okay, so I might add that in. If Sanders had not included this story, then we wouldn't have been able to understand why he takes such a strong position on our right to protest, or our right to free speech. Okay, so we have our general argument now stated, right? We could clearly build, I think, from this into a paragraph. And then you can think about possible counter-arguments or rebuttals. Maybe you think, what would some people say to challenge you on this? But he only uses one personal story. Or when he said this personal story, he didn't have much pathos or much feeling in his voice, right? You'd have to then rebut that. And again, with counter-arguments and rebuttals, sometimes they're small little tips of the hat, right? Even though he could have used a little bit more emotion in his voice, ultimately, the personal story helped establish the pathos of his overall argument. Notice that could be just a little snippet, or you could have an entire counter-argument paragraph where you say, however, or with this being, nevertheless, or with this being said, we need to address the fact that there wasn't a lot of overall pathos in his voice, or his tone was a little bit flat. So, I hope this helps. I hope this gives you a sense of how Toulmin logic can be used for rhetorical analysis. I do hope that you're drawing from this when you're writing your rhetorical analysis papers. You don't have to do this type of work with every single paragraph in your essay, but I do want to see that you're drawing from this and seeing the ways that you can use Toulmin rhetoric to really strengthen the overall logic of your arguments.